I am Julius Caesar, a Roman general and statesman, known for my pivotal role in the fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire, ultimately becoming dictator before my assassination in 44 BC. Here are some facts about me. I had a relationship with my killer's mother. My daughter's death devastated me. I executed my relative. Epilepsy was my curse. All facts are truth. I am ashamed of some things, and some things almost destroyed me. However, it is an integral part of my life. It proves that famous people have the same problems and life challenges as everyone else. Now all about it in more detail. Section 1. I had a relationship with my killer's mother. I had many relationships in my life, but perhaps none as complex and scandalous as the one with Servilia Scipionis. She was the mother of Brutus, a man who would later become known for his infamous role in my assassination. Our affair lasted for years, and its very existence was known throughout Roman society. It wasn't just a casual connection. It was a deep and public relationship, one that carried both political and personal significance. In many ways, the affair with Servilia embodied the contradictions of my own life, my ability to maintain political power while navigating the complex emotional and personal relationships that were entangled with it. Servilia was an attractive woman, and from the moment we met, there was an undeniable chemistry between us. She came from a distinguished family, and her marriage to the prominent Roman politician Marcus Junius Brutus the Elder placed her in the upper echelons of Roman society. Our relationship, however, was not merely one of passion, it was also intertwined with political maneuvering. Servilia was not only my lover, but she was also an ally in the turbulent and often dangerous political landscape of Rome. She was well connected, and her influence proved valuable in many ways. Our affair was likely known to many of our contemporaries, but it wasn't just the public nature of our relationship that made it so controversial. It was the scandalous implications it had on Roman society. The relationship between a man of my stature and a woman of Servilia's position was bound to attract attention, but there was another, even more complicated layer to our affair. Brutus, Servilia's son, would later rise to prominence as a political figure in his own right. As an adult, he became one of the leaders of the conspiracy that ultimately led to my assassination. The irony, of course, is hard to miss. Brutus, whom I had once treated with favor, who had been both a protégé and, in some ways, a trusted confidant, was the very person who would take part in my murder. This tragic irony is something that I have often reflected on during my life. There were rumors, of course, that Brutus was actually my illegitimate son. These rumors were never confirmed, but their existence was a constant undercurrent to our interactions. I had known Servilia long before Brutus came into political prominence, and it was often suggested that the closeness between Brutus and myself was more than just political. It was, in some minds, familial. These rumors were damaging to my reputation, but they were also dangerous in the context of Roman politics, where personal relationships and bloodlines were often inseparable from one's political standing. The fact that Brutus and I had such a close relationship, and that many believed he might be my son, only added to the complexity of the situation. When I look back on it, I can't help but think about how the relationship with Servilia affected both my personal life and my political career. There were certainly moments of pleasure and fulfillment, but there was also the weight of the consequences of such a union. The affair with Servilia was not just an affair, it was a political weapon in the hands of my enemies. There were those who used the speculation about Brutus's paternity as a way to undermine my legitimacy and to cast doubt on my character. Roman society was steeped in propriety, and any deviation from the norm was scrutinized. My relationship with Servilia, then, was seen not just as a personal indiscretion, but as a political misstep that could be exploited. Despite the scandal that surrounded our affair, I had a genuine affection for Servilia. She was a woman of intelligence, beauty, and influence, and I valued her counsel in many ways. It was clear to me that she had a profound understanding of Roman society and politics, and her support was crucial to my ambitions. However, the same qualities that made her an asset in my political machinations also made our relationship fraught with tension and complications. We both had our own agendas, and our affair was as much about survival and power as it was about love and desire. As time passed, the relationship between Brutus and I evolved. I took an active role in his political career, and it was widely believed that I favored him above others, even elevating him to important positions within the government. I valued his intellect and his potential, and I believed that he could one day become a great leader in Rome. The closeness between us, however, led to suspicions and rumors. Those who wished to undermine me in the Senate used our relationship to attack me, insinuating that I had given Brutus preferential treatment because of his possible connection to me. These rumors caused considerable strain in my personal and political life, but they also played a role in the conspiracy against me. When I considered the tragic events that followed, Brutus's involvement in my assassination, it is impossible not to think of the irony. Here was a man whom I had considered a trusted ally, a man whom I had brought into my inner circle and treated almost as a son, yet he was the one who participated in the plot to take my life. The realization that Brutus, if he was indeed my son, was the one who played a key role in my death is something that weighs heavily on me, even now. I had loved Servilia, and in many ways I had treated Brutus as a future leader of Rome. That a son, whether by blood or by affection, could turn on his father in such a way is a deep and painful irony. The consequences of this affair were felt not only in my personal life but also throughout Rome. Servilia's relationship with me was a source of both admiration and scandal. My enemies used it to discredit me, while my supporters often pointed to it as evidence of my power and influence. The political ramifications were immense. But the most painful consequence of all was the role that Brutus played in the conspiracy against me. Despite everything I had done for him, despite the years of mentorship and favor, Brutus chose to betray me, and the relationship that had once been one of the most important in my life ended in the most tragic of ways. Looking back on my life, I see this affair with Servilia as both a reflection of the complexities of Roman society and a personal tragedy. It was a relationship filled with both passion and political strategy, but it also carried with it the seeds of betrayal. In the end, it was the very man I had treated with favor, the man I had considered almost a son, who would participate in the plot that brought my life to a violent and unjust end. And for all the power I wielded in Rome, for all my accomplishments, it is this betrayal that remains one of the most enduring legacies of my life. Section 2. My daughter's death devastated me. Julia's death was one of the most personal and devastating moments in my life. She was my only legitimate child, my beloved daughter, and losing her felt like losing a part of myself. People often talk about the political implications of her death, how it weakened the alliance between Pompey and me, how it set the stage for the civil war that eventually tore Rome apart. But what they often overlook is the personal grief I experienced, the deep sorrow of losing a child, and the void it left in my life. Julia's marriage to Pompey was not a love match in the traditional sense. It was a political alliance, one that solidified the power of the first triumvirate. Pompey, the military genius, and I, the rising political power, needed each other. But what many don't know is that despite the political nature of their union, Julia and Pompey developed a strong and affectionate bond. They grew to love each other, and the marriage, while born out of necessity, became something deeper over time. I had always hoped that their union would keep the peace between Pompey and me, two men whose ambitions were so intertwined with the fate of Rome. Julia, in many ways, became the bridge that held our alliance together. When Julia died in 54 BC, complications from childbirth took her from us. It was not just the loss of a daughter, it was the loss of a political connection that had been so important to maintaining the balance of power. But the personal grief was overwhelming. She was young, only in her 20s, and had her whole life ahead of her. As a father, you never expect to bury your own child, and the fact that it happened to me was something I couldn't prepare for. Pompey, too, was devastated. Our alliance, which had been cemented through Julia's marriage, began to crack in the wake of her death. The bond between us, which had once been so strong, began to fray. I couldn't help but feel that the loss of Julia was the beginning of the end for our once great partnership. In the years that followed, Pompey and I drifted further apart. There were growing tensions, political disagreements, and ultimately, we became rivals. The bond that Julia had forged between us was no longer enough to hold our alliance together, and it wasn't long before we found ourselves on opposite sides of a bitter civil war. In the years after her death, I often thought about how different things might have been if she had lived. Would Pompey and I have been able to maintain our alliance? Would we have been able to hold back the forces that eventually tore Rome apart? The loss of Julia not only devastated me personally but also marked the beginning of a long, painful period of political conflict. And the truth is, I could never fully reconcile the grief I felt with the political realities of the time. Julia's death also had an impact on my relationship with my other family members. It deepened the rift between me and my wife Calpurnia, who had always been distant and difficult to manage. Her inability to provide me with a legitimate male heir had been a source of frustration, and after Julia's death, that frustration turned into resentment. Calpurnia and I drifted further apart, and though I tried to maintain the image of a strong and united family, the truth was that the death of my daughter had left a permanent scar on all of us. The grief I felt was compounded by the sense of helplessness that came with it. As a ruler, I was accustomed to controlling the fate of others, shaping the course of events, and making decisions that impacted the future of Rome. But with Julia's death, I was reminded that there were some things even I could not control. No amount of power or influence could bring her back. It was a reminder of the fragility of life, of how quickly things could change, and how little we can really control in the end. After her death, I threw myself even more into the political and military affairs of Rome, as though by focusing on those things, I could bury the pain I felt. But no matter how many battles I won, no matter how many victories I achieved, the loss of Julia was always there, lurking in the background. It was a wound that never truly healed, a reminder that no matter how great one's power, there are forces in life, death, grief, loss, that cannot be overcome by ambition or strategy. Looking back, I can't help but think about how things might have played out differently if Julia had lived. Would Pompey and I have been able to avoid the civil war? Would the political landscape of Rome have been different? It's impossible to say for sure, but what I do know is that her death marked a turning point in my life, both personally and politically. Julia's death, while a personal tragedy, also played a pivotal role in shaping the future of Rome. The political vacuum that followed her passing was part of what led to the eventual collapse of the triumvirate. Pompey, no longer bound by his marriage to my daughter, began to align himself with the Senate, moving away from our once strong partnership. As I reflected on it in the years that followed, I couldn't help but think about the deep irony of it all, how the personal loss of a daughter, something that no ruler should have to experience, set off a chain of events that ultimately led to the downfall of everything I had worked for. In the end, Julia's death was not just the loss of a beloved daughter, but the beginning of the unraveling of a carefully constructed political order. The grief I felt over her passing, the personal pain of losing her, was compounded by the knowledge that her death had political consequences that would echo throughout Rome's history. I would go on to lead Rome into more wars, to make more alliances, and to continue my conquests, but I could never fully escape the loss of Julia. She was my daughter, and she was taken from me far too soon. Her death was not only a personal tragedy but also a tragedy for Rome itself. Section 3. I executed my relative. The execution of Lucius Cornelius Cinna the Younger is one of those decisions that still haunts me when I reflect on the early stages of my rise to power. He was a relative by marriage, part of my first wife Cornelia's family. In the chaotic political environment of Rome, where alliances were as fickle as the tides, I had to make some ruthless decisions. Cinna's execution, though politically motivated, was one such moment that likely caused me personal regret, despite the necessity of the action in the broader context of my ambition. Cinna had been an ally of mine, at least for a time. He had supported me when I was working to cement my power, especially after my return from exile. He was a member of the populace faction, much like myself, and our interests aligned in many ways. But in Roman politics, loyalty is often a fleeting commodity. When I returned to Rome, I faced a host of enemies, many of whom were once friends or allies. Political calculations took precedence over personal relationships, and Cinna's alignment with the opposition party, the Optimates, was the beginning of the end for him. The political landscape in Rome was a battlefield where allegiances shifted quickly. Cinna's role in the conspiracy against me during the turbulent years of my political struggle was a direct threat to my survival. Despite his earlier support, he had become a pawn in a larger struggle for power. As the Optimates, led by figures like Pompey, Cato, and others, became more hostile to my rise, I knew that I had to make examples of those who dared to oppose me. This was not just about punishing Cinna. It was about sending a message to anyone who might consider standing in my way. The execution of Lucius Cornelius Cinna was a brutal, yet necessary, act of consolidation of power. In the moment, I justified the execution by the political realities at hand. Rome was in a state of constant flux, and there were threats everywhere. I had to protect myself and my vision for Rome, even if that meant taking drastic measures against former allies. But over time, as I rose to greater power and my position seemed more secure, I could not help but reflect on the personal nature of this act. Cinna was not just a political enemy, he was family, a relative by marriage, tied to the memory of my first wife, Cornelia. Her family had been with me through the toughest times, and to execute a member of her family was not a light decision. The weight of that betrayal, however necessary it might have been for my political survival, weighed heavily on me. The regret I felt was not about whether the execution was justified, it was. But it was about the deeper human cost of my actions. Cinna's death was a result of the relentless ambition that drove me, the ambition that often made me view people as tools to be used and discarded. The personal connections I had, the bonds I had formed through marriage and alliance, became secondary to the bigger picture. I had once seen Cinna as a possible ally, someone who could help me in my struggle for power. But in the end, he became an obstacle, and I eliminated him, as I had done with others who stood in my way. It is one thing to make ruthless decisions in the heat of battle, but it is another to reflect on those decisions once the dust has settled. After Cinna's execution, I became acutely aware of the personal sacrifices I had made in pursuit of power. I had cut ties with many people, including family members, and lost sight of the human cost of my actions. I had been focused on survival, on winning at all costs, but the execution of Cinna forced me to confront the collateral damage of my choices. I had sacrificed relationships, trust, and perhaps even a sense of morality, all in the name of securing my place at the top. But the nature of Roman politics did not allow for such luxuries as personal regret. Once the deed was done, there was no room for reflection or remorse. It was a lesson I would learn time and time again. In the pursuit of power, there is little room for sentiment. The execution of Cinna was just one of many acts of political violence I would order in my career, and each one of them was justified in the name of survival and ambition. But when I look back on those moments, I can't help but feel the weight of what I lost in the process. The relationships that were broken, the trust that was shattered, and the personal connections that were severed in the name of power. In the grand scheme of my life, the death of Cinna might seem like a small event, but it was a turning point for me personally. It marked the moment when I truly understood the cost of power. The lines between politics and personal relationships had become blurred, and I had become a man who was willing to do anything to achieve his goals, even at the expense of those closest to him. In the end, the death of Cinna was not just a political necessity. It was a reflection of the person I was becoming. A man who had to sacrifice his humanity for the sake of ambition, a man who had learned that in Rome, loyalty was fleeting, and survival required sacrifices that were often too great to bear. Looking back, I wonder what might have happened if I had made different choices. Would the political landscape have shifted? Would I have been able to achieve my goals without resorting to such ruthless measures? The answer is unknown, but the execution of Lucius Cornelius Cinna the Younger stands as a stark reminder of the brutal realities of Roman politics and the personal sacrifices I made in my quest for power. Section 4. Epilepsy was my curse. Throughout my life, I was known for my strength, my intellect, and my unrelenting pursuit of power. But there was something about me that few knew, something that I tried to keep hidden: my epileptic seizures. In a world that placed such immense value on physical and mental perfection, especially in leaders, this condition was seen as a weakness. It was a vulnerability that I did not wish to reveal, for I knew it could undermine my authority in the eyes of the Roman people. Epilepsy, in the eyes of many, was not just a medical condition. It was often seen as a divine curse, a sign that the gods were displeased or that a person was somehow flawed. Epileptic seizures were not something that the ancient Romans understood well. Medical knowledge at the time was rudimentary at best, and anything that seemed to challenge the body's usual functions was often viewed through a supernatural lens. People who suffered from seizures were often seen as unfit for leadership, and some believed that the gods used these seizures as a way of demonstrating their power. In a society where physical prowess and mental clarity were idealized, a leader who was prone to such weakness might be considered unworthy of command. For me, this reality was deeply troubling. I was a man who thrived on control over my circumstances, control over my destiny, control over the fate of Rome itself. The idea that I might lose that control to something as unpredictable and uncontrollable as a seizure was, in many ways, a personal nightmare. I had worked tirelessly to craft an image of invincibility, one that reflected the ideals of Roman leadership, strength, rationality, and fortitude. To reveal that I was prone to a condition that could strike at any moment seemed to contradict everything I had worked for. It could weaken my position, both politically and personally. As a young man, I was not immediately aware of the condition that would later define my private struggles. But as I rose through the ranks of Roman society and politics, I began to experience episodes that could not be easily explained away. In those moments, I could feel my body betray me, my muscles tightening, my vision blurring, my mind slipping away. These moments were terrifying, and I knew that if anyone found out about them, it could be the end of my career. In a way, they were my greatest secret, one I hid with great care. The secrecy surrounding my condition became all the more important as I gained more power. With each victory, each conquest, and each political maneuver, I was building an image that needed to be flawless, untouchable. The notion that a leader could have a physical weakness like epilepsy was something that could not be allowed to slip into the public consciousness. The Roman people had to see me as a godlike figure, a leader whose mind and body were both perfect and invulnerable. To admit to a weakness like epilepsy would have been to tarnish that image. The truth, however, is that I was not invulnerable. I had moments of weakness, moments when I was at the mercy of my body. There were times when the seizures were particularly severe, and I was left feeling completely powerless. But my ambition, my pride, and my relentless drive kept me moving forward. I couldn't afford to let these episodes define me, and I worked tirelessly to conceal them from the public eye. Still, despite my efforts to hide it, there were moments when my condition could not be entirely masked. The symptoms, especially during a seizure, were hard to hide, and it was not unusual for those closest to me to witness what happened when I was overcome by an attack. I learned to recover quickly, to hide my vulnerability behind the mask of a strong and confident leader. But in private, I struggled with the knowledge that my body was not as strong as my mind, that there was a part of me that could not be controlled. Looking back, I can see how my epilepsy shaped my relationship with power. In a way, it drove me to work harder, to prove to myself and to others that I was more than just my physical body. My mind, my ambition, my ability to lead, those were the things that defined me. I wanted to be remembered as a great leader, not as a man who had been plagued by a physical ailment that was beyond his control. At times, I questioned how much of my ambition was driven by the need to overcome this vulnerability. Was it my desire for power that made me push myself so hard, or was it the fear that my condition would eventually be discovered? It's hard to say for sure, but I know that I was always determined to prove that I could rise above the limitations of my body. Despite the personal toll that epilepsy took on me, I did not allow it to stop me from achieving my goals. I knew that I had to keep moving forward, that I could not afford to let my seizures define me. In a way, they became a part of the backdrop of my life, something I had to manage and keep hidden, but never something that would dictate my destiny. I believed that power was the ultimate tool for control, and that if I could achieve enough of it, I could protect myself from anything, including the unpredictability of my own body. As I grew older and my career expanded, I continued to experience seizures. But I became more adept at hiding them, more focused on maintaining the image I had built. The condition was a part of my life, but it was not the defining part. What mattered was my ambition, my genius, and my ability to shape the future of Rome. In many ways, I think I saw my condition as a challenge to overcome, a test of my resilience and determination. It was not a moral failing, but in the eyes of many, it would have been seen as one. And that's what made it such a personal struggle for me, trying to reconcile my own physical limitations with the public image I had worked so hard to create. In the end, my epilepsy was just one more battle I had to fight, one more challenge in a life that was already full of them. I faced the world with the same intensity and determination that I applied to every aspect of my life, and I refused to let it define me. It was a secret that I carried with me throughout my career, one that weighed heavily on me but never stopped me from striving for greatness. I was determined to make my mark on the world, and nothing, either my body nor my enemies, would stand in my way.